Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening. Wherever you are in the world, we welcome you to today's webinar, Real Customer Successes, Business Transformation Through Information Governance. I'm Tom Murphy, General Manager and Editorial Director for Simpler Media Group and CMSWire. I'll be your moderator today and be happy to take your questions at the end of the program. We have an agenda for today's program that's very simple. It's just a few minutes of introductions, and then I'll introduce our guests, Barclay Blair and Stephen Ludlow. Our last portion is the Q&A session. If you have questions, we'll explain how to ask those. First, I'm going to point out our chat feature. If you have a button at the top or bottom of the right side of your screen that says chat, please click it now and you'll see a chat box open up on the right side. There's a little pull-down menu, and that bottom arrow, you can see it points to all participants in the sample. Don't do that. That goes to everybody. Choose the CMSWire host or one of our panelists or the panelists in general if you'd like to ask a question, and we'll take care of that. That's especially helpful if you're having technical difficulties. If you have a question for our panelists, you can ask that at any time during the program. Just put it in the Q&A section down at the bottom of the right side of your screen. You'll see a little Q&A there. Open up that box, and you'll see a dialog box. Send that up to the CMSWire host, and we'll address that for you. We are not going to have interactive polls in this program, so I'm going to skip over to tell you a little bit about CMSWire, which was founded in 2003. We have more than 400 editorial contributors. Hundreds of them are people just like you, practitioners in the field who want to share their expertise and their opinions on major practices in today's field. So please check us out if you're not familiar with our site. I think you'll like it. We have over 200 articles a month. We have monthly editorial themes that focus in on particular subjects and dive deeply into them. We have tweet jams, hangouts, market webinars like this, and much more. And our primary topic areas are customer experience, digital marketing, social business, enterprise collaboration, and enterprise information management. Whoops, skip the slide there. Don't want to skip this one. Our program is sponsored by OpenText, a global, publicly traded Canadian software company with more than 8,200 employees in 140 offices around the world. You can find out more about OpenText at opentext.com. And now it's my pleasure to introduce our two panelists today. Stephen Ludlow is Director in Product Marketing at OpenText. He leads the e-discovery and information governance practice and ensures customers address compliance and litigation risks while they're deriving maximum value from their assets. Our second speaker today, actually our first speaker, will be Barclay T. Blair, Executive Director and founder of the Information Governance Initiative. He's an advisor to Fortune 500 companies, software and hardware vendors, and government institutions. He's also the award-winning author of Information Nation, 7 Keys to Information Management Compliance, Information Nation Warrior, and Privacy Nation. Thank you and for being with us today, gentlemen. And now I'm going to turn the microphone over to Barclay to start his presentation. Barclay, please take it away.
Thanks, Tom. And thanks to everybody for joining today. And I'm looking forward to our conversation together. So I was just going to kick off our discussion today, just telling you a little bit about the Information Governance Initiative to give you some context for our discussion. So the IGI is a think tank and a community and a consortium devoted to one thing, which is advancing the adoption of information governance. And the IGI came out of a conversation that myself and the other members of the leadership team have been having for several years about the need for some kind of group, some kind of gathering place for all the different facets of information management to come together to have this discussion. And, you know, this was motivated by the observation with clients and organizations around the globe, all struggling with the same problem, which of course is, you know, this incredible amount of information that they're creating and trying to actually extract value from that, trying to use that information in an intelligent way to try and transform their business and remain competitive. So we started about a year ago, and we've been pedal to the metal over the last year, producing a number of research reports and events, and so look for more of that as we go into 2015. One of the things we did, which you see on your screen, is mid-year we did a very large survey report which we called our annual report. You can get a copy of it, free on our website. But we advanced the definition of information governance, frankly, in some ways, because we were sick and tired of having the conversation about what information governance actually is. And we advanced this definition to our community, and our community overwhelmingly, I think 98% or something, said that this is the definition they agree with, that information governance is the activities and technologies that we employ to maximize the value of information while minimizing risk and cost. So that's what Stephen and I are going to talk about today, is kind of that dynamic between that desire, of course, that has funded a lot of activities in this space, the desire to reduce risk and cost, but looking forward to the leading organizations that are taking that foundation and using it to move towards the future by building value from their information. And today, we're going to talk at length, and you're getting a sneak peek of this. You're the first to actually get access to this information. We conducted 30 in-depth interviews with information governance professionals this year, and to ask them, what are they doing? What are they thinking? What's working? What is not? Because this is one of the requests we get most frequently, is just tell me what other people are doing. Am I ahead of the pack? Am I behind? Where should it be? So we're going to share some of those stories with you today and kind of use them to frame the discussion about business transformation. So I'm looking forward to that. So Stephen, why don't I hand it to you, and we'll start our discussion.
Thanks very much, Barclay. So OpenText is a vendor in the enterprise information management space, and being in that space and having been in that space for some time, one of the things that we get a really good look at is that across the board, what are the activities and technologies that organizations are actually adopting when it comes to governing their information? What are the policies they're using? What are the strategies they're using in order to govern their information? And I want to just start with a quick overview of what we're seeing organizations doing today in order to solve some of their perceived problems when it comes to enterprise information management, and in particular information governance of that information. And the starting point for most organizations still seems to be this idea that content sources need to be managed in order to be able to reduce a lot of the perceived cost and risk in those. And certainly thanks to some of the pressures by electronic investigations, e-discovery, storage, et cetera, organizations have looked at the different sources of information in their organization, whether it be email, SharePoint content, file servers, paper, we can go on, and looked at those and done a risk assessment of the content to determine what's the riskiest content in our organization, what's the content that's costing us the most money, where do we need to begin to try and address as a content source these different sources of information through a combination of policy and technology to reduce their costs, reduce the idea or get rid of the idea actually that we're going to hold on to all content forever, because holding on to all content forever has definitely been problematic for a lot of organizations. And so on a day forward basis, what most organizations are beginning to look at is this idea of creating stores of content where at a minimum we start with the idea of 100% coverage of a content source. So through capture or through policy, the idea that we're going to capture as much information as we can. And then because we're capturing so much information, look to use automated technologies to apply policy, to auto-classify the content and apply the policies of retention and disposition on content, with the end goal essentially of getting to the point where we can do defensible disposition on content, keep what we need to keep, and get rid of what we can get rid of. And combining a day forward strategy along with a strategy on what do we do with some of our content and some of the sins of the past around some of these areas. What organizations are also looking at is ways of being able to understand some of the legacy content that they have, or content that is not potentially valuable enough to think about moving, and understanding it well enough to be able to assess what you need to do with it. Again, use the capabilities of auto classification to apply policy on content to control that content, and potentially either make a decision whether to not to simply leave that content in place, to dispose of the content immediately because it has no ongoing and pervasive value, or for the content that is actually identified as having value, thinking about migrating that content into a longer term repository where the basic capability of document management, records management, and archiving become pretty prevalent and pretty useful in your capacity to be able to control the retention of that information and also manage it from a purely physical archive bits and bytes perspective in a repository where you can drive down costs for long-term retention purposes. And the key benefit, or certainly one of the most significant benefits associated to this, is this idea that this provides a platform for legal to be able to interact with content, or your audit community to be able to interact with content, et cetera, where they have either reduced or more or less eliminated a lot of the other sources where content needs to go on litigation hold and where content may eventually need to be collected from. So this idea of reducing the number of discoverable sources within the organization has become a really prevalent way of being able to reduce a lot of the pain and suffering induced by either e-discovery, electronic investigations, et cetera. And it certainly is being used as a way of being able to, in combination with defensible disposition of content, reduce a lot of the risk and cost associated to the uncontrolled growth of information. And so that's sort of just my starting point, Barclay, where we see organizations. Where are you at right now in terms of what you're seeing with organizations and what came from some of your interviews?
Yeah, I'm just, so in that, I really like that view of the world, which is you have this sort of day forward challenge and you've got the legacy challenge. Is there a maturity curve associated with that, Stephen, in terms of where you see most of your customers starting, or the posture they have towards those two kind of goals?
Not so much sometimes a maturity curve, but I think what we're seeing is a coverage curve. I think most organizations have looked at email, and email has been really prevalent as a problem, essentially, for a lot of organizations for a long time. And that's certainly an area where we see them starting. Yeah. And then most organizations begin to sort of just check boxes in terms of where they're seeing the most pain or the most risk or cost associated to the next sources. And this doesn't need to be a technology discussion all the time. It can be a combination of policy and technology, as an example, right? So you can have a policy about your instant messages that doesn't involve technology. It's simply an internal policy about how long you keep instant messages and how they're considered from a policy perspective in terms of them being conversational or transitory in nature, et cetera.
Right. Yeah, interesting. Well, yeah, let's talk about some of what we found in benchmarking the industry out there. And actually, before I do that, I neglected to mention, people are probably wondering, well, why are the IGI and OpenText doing a webinar together? Well, the reason is that OpenText was one of the very first supporters of the IGI, a charter supporter of the IGI when the IGI was basically just an idea. And so I just wanted to mention that we appreciate your leadership and supporting our efforts, and happy to be here with you today. So in this in the benchmarking report, let's talk about this one because this is interesting. This is Colleen, who is an information governance leader at a large information technology services and solution. Now, what's interesting here is that the company doesn't really have a formal IG program. But the support is growing, and it's seen as being part of an information assurance or information security program that's evolving there, which is, I think, interesting. We're seeing a lot of that. I think a lot of folks, probably in the audience that we're talking to, kind of think about records management being foundational for information governance, and certainly is. But we're seeing huge interest from the information security and data privacy side, and that's what happened here with Colleen. Now, what's interesting is that a big motivator for the IG program that Colleen's building here is a transition at the company to Office 365, so moving to the cloud. And the tip that comes out of her experience here, and we see this with lots of other companies, is that those are fabulous. Sometimes the only opportunity to actually start to inject information governance into the business process. You have this disruptive event, might be a migration, decommissioning, a new system, it might be an acquisition, divestiture, whatever it is, but there's money and there's political capital in a way to try and clean information up, get information organized, and so on. At the end of the day, if you're going to move to a system that manages your unstructured content, to see ROI from that system, you want to invest in a program to organize that and make sure that it's managed and secured properly. So that's one of the things that we saw with her, that this opportunity to move to the cloud is how she's building information governance into the IT and the business side. The other side of it is that she, like a lot of, I think, information governance professionals, did come from a records management background, and over time has evolved in her role into reporting into the office of the CIO and taking on a very different kind of strategic role that now is unfolding into an information governance role. So that's a real, key consideration for practitioners is, and it's very difficult, I think, to achieve what's possible with information governance without, being in the right place at an organization. Sometimes that's on the IT side, and we'll talk about that today. Sometimes it's legal, and there's other areas as well. It depends on a lot of factors. But so that's what we learned from that benchmarking effort there, Stephen.
So, Barclay, are you finding organizations are they talking internally right now as they move towards taking on cloud solutions like Office 365 and injecting governance, or is it something that is still being overlooked in a lot of cases?
We see it. We see it in our landscape, at least, as a top of mind concern for the people that come into our world. And I guess there's certainly some effect, bias effect there, in the sense that people come into our world are already thinking about information governance. However, I've been spending quite a bit of time in other areas like infrastructure, information security, big data, chief data officers, and I do think that there's this awareness that it's just frankly stupid, to move the pile of stuff from one environment to another. And a lot of the ROI calculations that these migrations are based on are actually based on doing some cleanup and doing some organization, and presumes some level of governance. I do think, however, most management structures at most companies are not up to the task of actually ensuring that governance considerations are baked into the IT process, and I think that's a problem.
Yeah, certainly what we're seeing is there are, almost all the companies we talk to have at least, had a conversation about moving to components to Office 365 or other cloud-based services for things like mail and document management. It's certainly interesting for us to see that essentially that really does a really good job of displaying what I was talking about earlier, the idea of one, what are we doing with day forward content, and how can we govern that content? And at the same time, using the same capability, same technology, same policies, et cetera, to look at how we address some of the content that we have from a legacy perspective and start to clean that up too.
Right.
And my only big thought on that is that get your day forward stuff right first, and then begin to work on cleaning up some of the sins of the past, for sure.
Right. Yeah, no, that makes sense, and I think there's definitely appetite for that, and that we've seen from our benchmarking and surveys as well. Well, let's talk about the next one. This is interesting. This is a very large biotech company. You can see they're spending significant dollars on information governance, and this is a professional, Tracy, who has information governance title and is actually in the security and infrastructure part of the company, and actually reports to the CIO. So she does own responsibility for records and information management, but also owns key responsibilities around security and privacy, and is in a broader. It's actually a much broader role than just the records and information management side, which is interesting. Now, one of the things that we heard from Tracy, which I think is really instructive, is that they are in the process of implementing a data loss prevention program. And so that, as a biotech company who has their core, their crown jewels, if you will, is their intellectual property, that's very critical, making sure that information doesn't escape, that it's not stolen, that it's not lost. And that's a really important business driver for them. But guess what? Wanting to do that, or the way they go about that, is actually by trying to automatically classify that information from a sensitivity or from an intellectual property perspective. And guess what? Doing that actually enables a whole bunch of other powerful things. It's not only retention, it's security, it's privacy, it's what is this from a business perspective and who needs to have it, and how do we marshal that to actually generate value and make new discoveries. And so, the lesson that we heard from Tracy is that, her program began with a focus on information security, specifically data loss prevention, and then moved out into an automated process for classification of content to enable that security, but then also to drive value from the information itself. So they didn't get anywhere. They had a program that was kind of fully manual and relied upon employees to do those classifications. It wasn't working. It wasn't successful. Once they moved towards the automation, they started to get the results that they wanted. So yeah, really, really interesting, I think, evolution here for an IG program.
Yeah, I wanted to talk about auto classification for a couple of seconds, actually, Barclay, because I find it's always a very interesting topic, in that a lot of people, because it is new technology, have been putting more or less their own definitions on it. And what I really wanted to talk about were, what is it taking for most organizations to consider that auto classification is acceptable for their organization. And we've really been able to boil it down to a couple of things by talking to a lot of people in the records and information management industry. It comes down to two things, really. One is transparency, this idea that you're not working with a black box when it comes to trying to get good results out of your auto classification technology. You're working with an application that allows you to understand how you're training the system to be accurate, and ways of being able to make it more accurate over time. And so we felt that it's important to more or less have an application that can be run by the people who understand the content best, which is typically the records and information management and information governance people within the organization. And we have a tuning guide which allows you to do a good job of getting good quality results in your auto classification. The other part of it is defensibility, this idea that at some point, somewhere down the road, in all likelihood, someone will ask you to justify why you do or do not have documents, and whether that be a regulatory organization, whether it be a judge, et cetera. Somebody is going to ask for some form of justification around your information management program, and nobody really wants to have to say that we're not really sure the algorithm told us to keep this content, or the algorithm told us to get rid of this content. And so, taking some of the principles from the e-discovery world, we've been able to say that the best way of being able to defend what you're doing is to not base it on the technology, but base it on the results. And the results are based on the idea that you can do statistical sampling of content in order to be able to get a reasonable idea of how good a job your system is doing in classifying content based on quality assurance. So going through sampling content and ensuring that today you're getting good results, tomorrow you're getting good results, and then 2 months from now when you do another sample, you're getting good results then at that time. And from a defensibility perspective, again, what you're defending are the good results that we're getting, rather than the actual technology involved in actually getting those good results.
Right.
How it actually works from our perspective is we have auto classification that classifies content based on the idea that you train it using machine learning based on most of the time example documents that are similar to documents of a particular classification or the policy that you want to apply onto it. So that's really where it becomes important that subject matter experts are the ones that need to be able to use this application, because they understand both the policy and why the policy is applied, and the content to understand, what what makes good example content that will help you to get good, accurate results. And the end result for all that is that it completely removes end users from the equation, which is really important most of the time when you're considering that the amount of content that we're talking about capturing, whether it be through email or other sources of content that are flowing in really large volumes with really quite minimal touch in the most part for most organizations now. And again, it's been an application that we've created with and for information governance professionals, because we feel it's important that they're the ones that are going to have to run this application.
Well, I think that's the key, right? Is it's, you know, with auto classification, it's I think a lot of folks believe it's sort of this push button operation, but the reality is that, you know, you need some expertise about your information, and I think that RIM professionals are ideal folks to drive that. And I think we'll talk about that later as well. But let's talk about our next benchmark. You know, the 30 that we did this year. This is how I like to think of this one is that you have, you know, an insurance company who basically doesn't buy into the idea of information governance as an insurance policy. You know, and that is a motivator for a lot of companies. A lot of companies sort of see investing in the management of information as a way to insure them against, you know, future claims that they threw away the wrong thing or tried to destroy a piece of evidence, or perhaps even insulate or protect the company from the actions of the employees. Ingrid, who is our IG professional, she's a information management advisor at this large insurance company, and she's in the process right now of developing an IG strategy for the company. And she's got two big projects. One is rolling out an ECM system, and the other is actually revisiting the retention schedule. And within that, they're building a much larger IG framework and standards for the company, which will take into account all the facets of IG, from security and privacy to business considerations, as well as the legal. For one of the problems that they had was that, and we see this actually quite a bit, is that there's certainly, when it comes to frameworks and policies, there's a desire, and a well-justified desire, for simplicity. And I think that the reasons for that are obvious. Part of the challenge here is that a lot of this is not simple, and certainly for an insurance company that functions globally, by no means is the management of information simple. It's an information-intensive business. It's regulated in the U.S. at the state level, and it's a complex situation. So they had actually developed a retention schedule that, a so-called big bucket retention schedule. What they actually found when they went to implement that is that the business didn't see itself in that schedule. And in effect, they'd lost some of the detail and granularity that allowed that schedule to be connected to a business process. So that's part of what Ingrid here in our benchmarking interview is trying to solve. The other thing is that there's huge resistance, and I'm sure many of our audience members experience this. There's huge resistance from management about doing anything that's going to have a negative impact on employee productivity. So again, Ingrid is automation, trying to reduce the workload on the employee and fundamentally embed information governance into the way they work, rather than make it an extra process, is her focus, and what it will take for her to be successful in her IG program.
So this is interesting for me, Barclay, because insurance companies being a really good example of organizations that have either been very paper-based in their processes, or have looked at their electronic information and said, we probably need to keep a lot of our information for the life of the policyholder plus a certain number of years, and in a lot of cases have said, it'd be just easier just to keep everything forever.
Right.
And this is where from the perspective of selling information governance, it begins to get a little bit more difficult once you get out of the theoretical and get into what happens when you start to talk to the individual lines of business. And this is something I'm seeing more and more frequently these days as we begin to talk information governance, is that On the left and right of this view of the world, the risk and cost view, everybody understands and agrees that there is definitely risks and costs associated to storage, e-discovery and investigations. There's digital privacy rights associated to particularly a lot of the European companies or European offshoots. There's the idea that we need to be able to understand the information that we have and understand PII or personally identifiable information and other credit card information, et cetera, in our content. So there's certainly lots and lots of risks of costs. And that view that I had of the information where we're looking at broadly controlling information sources is very good at addressing risks and costs. But I question, at some point, the value that's being added in a lot of cases in managing information that way, because really what we're talking about using a defensible deletion policy against, 100% capture of content is we're really just separating the wheat from the chaff. So yes, we have the capacity, hopefully, to get rid of a lot of the stuff that we don't need to keep. But I really question on whether or not we're actually adding value. We're certainly, hopefully, not detracting value, but we're not necessarily adding value. And where a lot of focus on is clearly these days is top line growth and the projects in the organization that can impact top line growth. And so I'm beginning to see, I think, the idea that information governance needs to be about more than risk and cost. What are you seeing these days?
Well, yeah, Stephen, that's exactly what we're seeing in our research is that, we asked people, a bunch of questions in our annual survey this year. And one of them was, what kinds of projects are you taking on right now? And what projects, do you think you'll be taking on, in the next 18 months? And you can very clearly see the curve where the focus of most information governance programs is taking care of the foundational risk elements. And I think that makes sense. It's a natural place to start in terms of building a foundation so that that you're functioning as a business in a manner that's compliant in it and addresses the risk side of the equation. But ultimately, the opportunity and the long-term value proposition of information governance is to then build from that foundation and find a way to deliver value. So, for example, we had someone we talked to is a global construction company, and in that business, what's interesting is that there's completion funds that are held back by the building owner when you build a skyscraper or a bridge or what have you. And in that industry, it's common as a matter of course for the building owner to make some kind of claim that there is a defect simply because in the 2 or 3 years it'll take litigation or a settlement to wind its way through the process, they're sitting on an extra $20 million for 2 or 3 years. And so for this organization, information governance, yes, they had some compliance concerns and litigation and so on, but a huge driver was we want to be able to marshal our information so that when we go to that completion meeting and some kind of complaint is made, like, for example, you poured this foundation when it was 40 below and the cement didn't set up properly, we can show our quality control, we can show the photographs that the foreman took, we can show the tests that we did and all of the processes that we go through and put that complaint to bed and effectively get $20 million in the bank 3 years earlier. So really, it's an example of the kind of things that we hear and we see and that companies are doing that are fueling the value side of information governance. One of the, if we want to move on to one of our other benchmarking stories. Now, this is a large manufacturer, and we have, I think, this is a situation that a lot of professionals in this space find themselves in, that they've got, there's no senior executive waving the flag for them or is a clear sponsor of the IG program. There is, perhaps a perception that the activities are really just focused on the risk and cost side, and it's not something that business leaders want to spend a lot of time on unless they're heavily regulated and doing things that require that. So the challenge for Bob here is how do you move a program forward in a situation like that? Now, interestingly, one of the opportunities for Bob was, again, that the company is moving to the cloud, and there's widespread use of cloud collaboration tools and so on that have very little by way of governance. And within his organization, the importance of the information that's being shared, the importance that it's accurate and it's right, and that it's reliable is critical. And so that was a big motivation for starting to build out the IG function at this organization and to start to mature. Now, one of the things that's been successful for Bob is that, he doesn't, a lot of folks say you need to become an expert at selling information governance internally if you want to build your program. And I think that's a valid point. Now, what Bob focused on was instead trying to pick projects that were small and weren't going to change the world, but really would demonstrate not only the capability of his organization, but the value proposition of information governance generally. And so, like a lot of organizations, there was an initial effort to focus on just helping the HR department get their act together. There's compliance considerations there, but fundamentally, it's a document-intensive, an unstructured, information-intensive environment, and doing their jobs better and faster, which are company critical, is not only has value because people want to get paid at the end of the month, but it's also a visible part of the organization that with a success there, you have a good story, you have good visibility that you can use to sell out to the rest of the organization. So that was one of the things we learned from talking with Bob is that look, even if you're not at that level of maturity where you have senior executive support, you can make progress and you can demonstrate success, and that bodes well for pushing forward with an IG program.
Thanks, Barclay. So one of the things that I am certainly seeing, and it's very interesting to watch, because one of the things that clearly from an OpenText perspective that we see fairly frequently is organizations at very different stages of their information governance programs, and very different stages in terms of the potential impact of information governance and the idea that it's important to sell information governance to executives for sponsorship, for resources, for technology, and even the necessity to be able to have or executive backing when it comes to making sure that people are actually following policies, et cetera. And so what we're seeing essentially is a little bit of a vicious cycle where there's a lack of executive sponsorship and a lack of understanding. And so the desire is to show executives that it's not just risks and costs that information governance does, it's that it adds value as well. However, the perception, and when we talk about it again, is that in the end, a lot of the time that information governance is only going out and impacting what would be considered risks and costs. In a lot of cases, this idea of the cost of doing business today, and that the cost of doing business, the way we're doing business today, is probably less than the cost of change in a lot of cases. And the most, the biggest indicator you can always see around that in a lot of cases is this idea that storage is cheap, because that's not an answer. Storage is not cheap. Nobody even really considers that storage is cheap, but certainly storage is often very much cheaper than the cost of changing things in a way that will meaningfully impact your storage. And so organizations are looking to do the ROI calculation simply on either scare tactics associated to risk, or cost very often associated to storage, and to a certain degree discovery, et cetera. And it brings us back to executives say, yeah, well, maybe that's not where I need to be, and off we go again into a circle of where information governance professionals feel a little bit unloved in a lot of cases, but ignored in some cases. And even when they can get their sell the idea and the policy, there has to be more to it than selling just the idea of policy. And I think what we're finding is that organizations need to get to the point where they actually can agree on what value is. And when it comes to, in particular, unstructured information, I think, by nature, we all actually understand what is valuable content in our organization. It's essentially everything that we would say is business critical. And we have hundreds of different types of business critical information within the organization, whether it's financial documents or contracts, invoices, the stuff that's related to our performance reviews, the engineering documents. We can go on and on in terms of the importance of our unstructured information in our organization. It's the lifeblood of knowledge workers. And the added value in most cases that from a information governance perspective is knowing, not only where those valuable documents are and putting them in the hands of the right people at the right time, but also putting it in context, putting it around, the decisions that, got us to where we are on specific documents. What was the background information in a contract? What are the related documents in contracts? Are there, invoices associated to this contract and this PO? And what becomes really prevalent is that the value in a lot of this case is in being able to understand and relate the information to the structured information that is coming out of our business processes and our most critical business processes. So if you consider, if you look over again to the left at our financial documents, our contracts, our HR documents, there's business process associated to that. So in context means in context of the business process, with structured information to make it findable, structured information used to be able to drive security, structured information to be able to drive the life cycle of content as well. Again, in an automated fashion, in fact, in a fashion that you don't have to have the human involved in putting the context around documents when you're relating the information directly to the business process in context, in a manner that will in fact demonstrate the value of content moving forward. And if you consider where organizations are at these days, in that I think we might finally be at a point where we are getting to the point where we're transforming the business, not just on the marketing front end to a digital world, but in the back end of the organization as well, to digitizing our processes, getting rid of paper and getting rid of what I would consider to be paper-based siloed processes, where we can begin to use both the combination of all the tools that we have in our hands to create electronic information, along with the tools that we have to integrate information together from a data perspective as well. And so I think using this idea that organizations are beginning to transform their business to become digital is an area where we can see from an information management perspective that people in the line of business begin to look at information exceptionally differently than we do typically from an information governance perspective. In the line of business, typically you're thinking about information sources and how it impacts my business process on a day-to-day basis. So if you're in accounts payable, you're interested obviously in invoices and POs, exceptions to those processes, where that content comes in from. It can come in from scan, it can come in from an email. You might find it being dumped off in a file server, lots of different places where that information might be coming from. And we want to understand it well enough to be able to relate it to our accounts payable process. Same thing happens in you brought up construction projects, right? Construction projects generate a massive amount of information coming in from a massive number of different places. The importance of being able to demonstrate the way the capital project was built, where the information is, making sure that it's the final copy, having that content together from all those different sources is, again, mission critical to the organization. And so as you begin to think through all these different business processes that are important, realize that once again, document management, records management, and archiving capabilities, long-term storage of information, understanding the life cycle of the information, being able to find that information, it's once again critical, but I looked at it in a very, very different way from that perspective. And, clearly what we're really talking about is enterprise content management. And this idea of enterprise content management and having value around the content at the same time as thinking about, the risk and cost is pretty critical. Are you have you worked with anybody in your survey that is gone beyond risk and cost to get to value?
Yeah, one of the companies we talked to, and we've seen this a few times in financial services and pharmaceuticals, that you have, in this case, it's Allison, who is heading up the program at this company, who they've invested heavily in technology and policies and programs to deal with the regulatory and litigation risk that they face every day. And that program is mature. And so one of the things that is exciting them, and I think does point to the future of information governance, and I talked about this before, is that they have now this powerful engine, this powerful set of tools that generically solve the problem of what do we have and where is it and what should we do with it. And that engine, that army, has been pointed at the problem of risk primarily. But now they've realized that they can actually point that at a business problem, and that's what they're doing. They're using these same systems and same processes and expertise that they've built around the risk side, and now turning it to the value side. And they're interrogating their data. They're asking their data questions about their customers. How can they understand their customers better? How can they understand what kind of programs they're looking for, and what kind of products they're looking for, and why does a customer stay? Why does a customer go? And all of that kind of analysis and understanding that's tied directly to revenue and even to profit. So I think that that's a really interesting model, one that we're seeing increasingly, where you have this infrastructure, this capability that can be turned to the value extraction side. The other thing interesting about Allison, what she told us, is that they, part of the key to that maturity was that, again, although she had to have a long-term strategic vision for where they were going with the program in order to make some of those major investments, but the key thing was along the way having short-term goals, things that, again, could demonstrate progress and demonstrate value and point the way to where they would be once they were mature in their strategy. So, yeah, very much. I think this is very much what we're seeing and where the energy and excitement is in information governance is, information governance as an enabler of data-driven business models. And I've spent a lot of time lately in the big data world, and that's a message that really resonates. That's in its infancy. The ability to extract value directly from data, even to monetize it, is really in its infancy in some ways, outside of course, very mature, BI programs. But those practitioners realize that, even the blocking and tackling of knowing what you have and the context of that information and what it's telling you, separating the signal from its noise, is the critical activity, and that's at the heart of information governance.
Thanks, Barclay. So I think I've heard a couple of times, and I brought it up once myself, I guess, is this idea of ECM and enterprise content management and information governance, and where do they intersect? And it's been interesting because, to a certain degree, one of the trends that has happened in the ECM world has been this idea of simplification. Is that there were ECM systems and they were complicated, and so from there we went to SharePoint, and from SharePoint it became too complicated, and we went to cloud-based file sync and share. And we're going to find that as requirements come along, those enterprise file sync and share things will become too complicated again, or at some point so simple that, to be honest, we have a hard time coming down to value in the content as well. And I think it's a time to begin to think about our content a little bit differently, and the way that we manage our content a little bit differently. And one of the things that I hear coming up very, very frequently in talking to a lot of customers is this idea of manage in place. And to be truthful, certainly this idea of manage in place for some content might be a good idea when it comes to our legacy content. But on a day forward basis, it doesn't make sense to be trying to manage content in 6, 7, 10 different silos throughout the organization, where that information is not pulled together and is not available to us in a manner that allows us to glue together our business processes and glue together making sure that we are getting value from our content and having it in the right place at the right time for the right person. And so a new way of maybe thinking about this is this idea of a business workspace where we use a lead application where people work on a day-to-day basis, and we can easily say things like ERP systems, CRM systems, where people are interacting with structured information, but also have a lot of unstructured information associated to it as well. Use that lead application to help to set automatically on our content the information, the right people that should have access to the content, provide a way of being able to add that content ourselves and use the structured information from the lead application in order to be able to apply the right metadata on our content to make it findable, make it useful, and put it in the right context for the right people at the right time again. And how this essentially happens is the lead application has within it the right roles, the right events and the right people, right transactions and information to be able to feed down into an ECM system that has, like OpenText, that has information that we need. So when we create a new person in HR for our new employee in HR, there's lots of information we know about that person, but there's also a bunch of unstructured information that we're going to want to keep about that particular user. There's annual letters that go out to the user, that probably the person's resume. There needs to be a workspace that is consistent for that information that allows us to quickly file that information into this area, but at the same time not burden the person who's interacting with the content and constantly filling in the employee ID on the document every time you add a new document, filling in the status of that employee. And then on the far end, at some point, we actually want to get rid of that information for the employee, 7 years after termination. We don't want to have somebody remember to have to go back 7 years after termination and say, okay, it's time to delete this information. We want to make sure that that event trigger is automatic and once again can come from the lead application. And so this idea of business workspaces can really turn around the way that we've been looking at ECM, because what it does is componentize things down to a single business process, and we work on making the information and structure, taxonomy, metadata, make that right for a single business process. And when we've solved that problem, we can go on to the next business process. And business workspaces doesn't make you have to go out and boil the ocean. It allows you to take small steps and fix business problems specific to the line of business. And really that's pretty critical, because this idea of being able to meet the needs of the line of business and at the same time having an overriding structure to help with capture of all the information that's flowing through the organization, applying classifications on the content and policy on the content, at the same time of being able to allow the system to interact with individual business processes, is really, essentially solving the problem that organizations are having in risk and cost and the value of information. And so a relatively complex looking diagram, but if you consider any organization, this is really what they're looking at, right? How do I interact with my content from a business process? And then how do I reduce the risk and cost of essentially just keeping everything or all the stuff that goes on outside of the business processes that doesn't tend to have long-term intrinsic value? So, as usual, Barclay, I always like to finish up with you on some final advice. And before we get going on final advice, any final comments before we get going?
Well, I think that, one of the questions I actually wanted to ask you, Stephen, is that, this vision of there kind of being an information backbone that's, supporting or connected to lead applications. When I think about, the folks that we benchmarked, that we talked to, and I think for them, a question is, how do they have the conversation with IT about that integration or about that architecture and how it can support their IG goals? How do they get IT on side for that?
So I think that is one of the most fundamental things that we're seeing from records and information management professionals and information governance professionals, is that sometimes knocking on the door of IT isn't the right place to go in a lot of cases, right? The organization or the parts of the business that have the problem of not having integrated processes, that have the problem of not being able to find the right information. They're looking for solutions, right? They're looking for ways of being able to, directly from SAP view the invoices and that are associated to a particular transaction. The idea then is really to engage the line of business and to go looking for problems to solve. And the conversation with IT comes down a little bit later on, when we begin to say that we have a solution for some problems. And I think that, if you had the conversation with IT to say that we have some solutions for your problems from an information governance or from a risk and cost perspective, but also here are a whole bunch of benefits that can be achieved by the business in these particular business processes, and attacking it from a process by process view of the world is really the way to get there and have that conversation with, obviously with IT, but the rest of the organization as well.
Yeah, that makes sense, and I think it actually does tie into the kind of the first piece of advice that we wanted to leave folks with, which is, what I always kind of say about IG is that you need to be opportunistic. It requires sticking your head up and understanding strategically where the organization is trying to go, where individual business unit, what their priorities are for that year, for that period, and then finding a way to automate processes to make them more efficient, to gain more insight from the data. All of those things require the skills and the tools of information governance. So identify those and go after them, I think is one of the things that really reverberated from the benchmarking work that we did.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more.
Yeah, go ahead. Do you want to?
Yeah, well, I was going to ask you for another piece of advice, really, around this idea.
Well, so one of the things that I think we've both talked about today in our conversation is, I don't think that IG has much chance of either really reducing risk and cost or generating value unless it's fundamentally embedded into the business process. And that's the future of information governance. And that's the reality of it, in fact, today, is that, company after company has the best program written down on a piece of paper, but it doesn't do anything because it's not integrated into the way that the company actually does stuff, the way that it works. And so that, information governance has to be tied to the business process. It has to be aligned, to known processes. You need to understand how does an invoice get made, and where are the opportunities, for example, to capture that information and do something smart with it. So rather than viewing it as a separate process or something that happens after or outside of the business process, this is the vision of IG that certainly we support.
Completely agree, and it more or less aligns back to the first point as well, which is business process and changing around business work, our internal processes as part of a digital transformation activity is something that organizations are looking at, again, because it's really impacting top line. And so I wanted to finish a little bit with something that I've found to be really prevalent these days, is that as information governance has become, hopefully getting out of the realm of buzzword and getting into the realm of activities that organizations are actually doing, this idea of automation and auto classification has grown to the point where people are beginning to believe that auto classification is a solution for everything that they do. And my mantra is horses for courses. Auto classification is really good for working with a lot of high volume, low touch content where we're really trying to reduce the risk and cost. But I think that we need to think about a new way of capturing content in context and making it available. And I think this idea of embedding into lead applications an ECM backbone is really a way of making sure that you're not asking end users to jump out of their business process. I think that in the past has been where ECM's really gotten itself a bad name, in that it was something you had to do once you were done. It was a filing activity like any other filing activity. And if we can get beyond that and make it just part of the business process, people interact with and do, go through business process all the time. And I think this idea of making sure that the most valuable content, the stuff that we run our business on and is part of business process, is the way to go for making sure that we're actually capturing the value from our information as well. Any other closing remarks or questions, Barclay?
No, I totally agree with that. I think that's it's information governance by design. I think that's the way that this is happening, the way it's going to happen as we move forward and grow and transform around information, as a whole.
Well, gentlemen,
Great.
I want to thank you very much for your time today. We're at the end of the program. It's been a fascinating presentation. If you want to learn more about OpenText, please contact them at this web address. And there's the email for Stephen and Barclay. We did not have time for Q&A today. We are going to collect your questions and forward them to the gentlemen, and hopefully they'll respond to them, or you can write to them directly at sludlow@opentext.com or barclay.blair@iginitiative.com. I want to thank our panelists for being with us today, Stephen Ludlow and Barclay Blair, for their thought-provoking ideas. And I want to thank OpenText and the Information Governance Initiative for being part of today's events. If your company is interested in sponsoring a webinar, please email us at advertising@cmswire.com. Signing off for Simpler Media Group and CMSWire, this is Tom Murphy. Thank you.